Hello and welcome to SSAT Upper Level Vocabulary. My name is Rose and I would love to talk so much about this specific series and introduce it to you as it follows. And so, keeping this in mind, let's go on to that first slide and talk about what this series is actually going to entail. And so, talking about the vocabulary overview here, we believe that it is necessary, particularly for understanding verbal, reading, and writing sample sections on the SSAT, particularly because this exam is going to have 4 different sections. One of these sections talk about mathematics, but the other 3, on the other hand, talk specifically about something related to English, reading, or writing. And so keeping this in mind, we believe that out of all the things that we would be wanting to focus on, it is absolutely crucial that we also cover vocabulary in order to fulfill these requirements and get that really good score that we want at the end of the day. So, this series will cover top 500 words, all included, particularly talking about the upper level vocabulary here, along with 6 synonyms, each totaling up to 3,000 total and more, as well as 40 sample sentences per lecture. Now, this is the exact same format that we are going to go with for the middle level as well, and so if you have not started with the middle level, I highly recommend going back and checking that one out first before we move on to the upper level. However, the point still stays the same. We're going to be talking about the other 500 words that are oftentimes considered a little bit higher, a bit more advanced compared to the middle level. And so, the question is then, why is this vocabulary series something that we really need to be focusing and studying instead? So why is this something that we want to be particularly paying attention to, especially the upper level? Well, first off, the answer to this is quite simple in the sense that we want to build on our middle level vocabulary. At this point in time, there should already be a little bit of a vocabulary, a bit of a lexicon in our heads about necessary words, necessary phrases that we might need specifically for this exam. And so, with that extra 500 that we will be tacking on to the already existent 500 words we know, we are now stuck with an entire 1,000 words that we will be looking at in its entirety along with this series in particular, which means that with that extra 500 and that extra 3,000 synonyms, you're going to have a lot to deal with, and also, again, more broadening of the horizons and talking a bit more specifically about the way that vocabulary can really help us expand our own knowledge of the language, but also do really well on the exam. This is the most important part. Additionally, we also want to talk about the SSAT upper level vocabulary because we want to be able to think really critically about language, but also understand nuance. And now this is going to be a topic that goes throughout the entire lecture series, both middle level and upper level, but specifically here talking about the hidden meanings behind every word that native speakers tend to use day to day. Now, this is not necessarily something that most people will talk about or teach. In a lot of these vocabulary series, we have our dictionary definition. We have our synonyms and we have our sentences. But a lot of times that nuance is missing, talking about context, talking about connotation. Maybe the word is correct, but no native speaker would actually use it this way. Adding that extra information, that knowledge, that detail will allow us to address these questions on the SSAT exam with a bit of a different perspective and also, more importantly, a much more advantageous perspective as well. Some additional perks that will also be addressed during this series here is that we will also be addressing the synonym questions for that reason in the verbal section of the exam. At this point, we already have 3,000 synonyms. Add another 3,000 on. We have 6,000 synonyms to look at. Some will overlap, of course, but the point here being we have so many words to look at, and therefore, for that verbal section, we're going to have such a broad variety of words to look into to help us answer these questions. Additionally, we have explanations that make the words easier to remember and recall, and word breakdowns with prefixes, suffixes, root words, history, and fun stories. This way, it's not just simple rote learning. We're not just memorizing words. Instead, we are remembering these words. We're going to be using these words, and we're going to keep them in our minds. That way we can recall upon them and actually use them later on, not just for this exam, but also so we can use it particularly in that essay prompt section. Again, we need to think a lot about that essay prompt section, about how we can remembering these words, using the right word in the right context, and so even for that part as well, we want to be keeping these 2 ideas in mind. And so the question there is, who is this lecture for? And so here we're talking about 500 vocabulary words, talking about the definitions for each one. Some of them will have more than one definition, which we will absolutely discuss. We will also be talking about all 6+ synonyms for each word that comes across us, along with all 4 sample sentences. Oftentimes, we will be reading each one, talking about it, explaining it, also understanding again the context, or perhaps even which synonym would work best depending on what kind of sentence you want to say. And so a myriad of synonyms that range from the most casual to the most advanced. For us, choosing the ones that we need to use is imperative. And so, when we're talking about casual to the most advanced, it could be words that we already know, words that are easy, words that give us context, but also words that are incredibly difficult, advanced, the ones that we will see in academic papers or on the SAT. And these words, again, very big variety. We're talking about difficulty, but also in terms of scope, it goes everywhere. It's very eclectic, there's a big variety. And so for us, it's going to give us a lot more information and kind of fill in the gaps a little bit for us, especially when we're learning vocabulary. And so this is exactly how we're going to be going about this particular series. Again, this is the upper level, so the words will be a bit more difficult. We will have the word up at the top, talking about the dictionary definition. Oftentimes, I will try to simplify it so it's easier to remember. And then adding on the synonyms, talking about the ones that are going to be used most often, the ones that we see the most often, the ones that have particular contexts or connotations that are directly the same. And then talking about the sentences themselves, again, talking about the word and the context, how we tend to use it, whether or not it's correct. And then adding on another 3 sentences on top of that, going one at a time, reading them out loud, knowing what the pronunciation is, and once more figuring out why it works, particularly in these sentences. Most important part, of course, whether or not it works. And so who is this lecture for again? Going back to this question, this series particularly is open for middle school students who need SSAT vocabulary training. But above all that, I would say that the students who I would highly recommend this to are those who want to expand on the vocabulary that is already existing, that already has been discussed, especially in that middle level, and they want to add on to it with the upper level as well, adding another 500 words. Again, that first middle level series here we're going to be talking about also, that one is going to give us that foundation that is necessary to understand this series. And so once more, highly recommend going back and seeing that if you haven't already. And so the necessity for the course, we're talking about vocabulary that will cover connotations, history, culture, and formality. Having all this detail is going to give us more context and can be applied, of course, in the 30 synonym questions, 30 analogy questions, 40 reading response questions, as well as the essay prompt in particular. I would like to highlight this one. We're going to be seeing it quite often on our exam because once more, with gusto, we would like to see it this way. This series will be applicable in 3 out of the 4 parts of the exam. Again, taking out that math portion, we're going to be seeing English everywhere. And so with that, we want to make sure that we get the best score that we possibly can. English is going to help us out immensely. Vocabulary specifically will help us out immensely, and that's the reason why I cannot stress enough or emphasize enough how important this series is, particularly for our students out there. And so a little bit about myself. I am currently working as a teacher here, listening and understanding students, particularly who want to do work overseas. They want to learn overseas. And so I particularly focus on things such as TOEFL, SAT. Also, as an essay specialist, I also talk about universities too, oftentimes university application essays or even the entrance exams as well. I cover all of these. And additionally to this also, I am also a native English speaker, born in the United States, raised in the United States, and I attended everything up to high school there until I moved to Korea specifically to study English language and literature at Korea University, at which point I graduated with great honors and a 4.32 GPA. And currently, I would like to say that I am currently a graduate of the Carnegie Mellon University's program in Literary and Cultural Studies, here receiving an MA, and I am currently also going to be moving into a PhD position studying post-colonialism, decoloniality, diaspora, and contemporary American studies, again within the Literary and Cultural Studies department. And so keeping this in mind, when we put all this together, what is it that we're trying to emphasize here? It is this general idea that the most important 500 upper-level vocabulary words with thousands of synonyms and sentences will be discussed specifically in this series. Again, we can talk about vocabulary in other kinds of series as well. But the most important part that I would like to suggest out of this specific series in particular is the fact that we will be discussing nuance, context, connotation, all of these little minute details that are particular for native speakers, but not necessarily for speakers of a second language. It's going to be much more difficult. And so, with that in mind, I would highly suggest this particular series to really emphasize how we can learn vocabulary in a new way, in an entertaining way, and also a way that will allow us to actually remember the words. That way, we can actually use them in context when necessary. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you in class soon. Welcome back, you guys. We're going to be starting off our SSAT upper level vocabulary like we always do at the very beginning of the alphabet. And so here I have for you guys a part 1, and let's go ahead and get straight into it with our first 10 words. Now, like always, let's go ahead and make sure that we say these out loud together so we know what the pronunciation is. Abdicate, accede, accord, accumulate, acquiesce, adage, adamant, adept, adhere, and adjacent. So let's go ahead and start with that first word, which is the word abdicate. And abdicate here is a verb meaning to relinquish something formally or to cast off. Synonyms are renounce, resign, cede, abnegate, relinquish, surrender, spurn, disown, and disclaim. So as we can understand with the synonyms and the dictionary definition here, we can tell that the word abdicate is probably more formal word and also means to get rid of something in a very formal way. So instead of just saying, I'm going to throw away this job that I have, or I don't want to be the prince anymore, we might say that we are abdicating the position instead. Again, it's to relinquish something or to get rid of something, but also to do it in a very formal manner. Which is why I would say that out of the synonyms, the best ones to use here would be the word resign, renounce, and also probably the word disclaim. I feel like this one is also a really good one, but I will note that the word disclaim also has a few other definitions, and so I feel like context is really important there if you're going to be using it. Compelled to abdicate his position as a prince, he withdrew to a monastery where he busied himself as a scribe. He wants to, live his life in a monastery as a monk, being a scribe. He wants to write. Then he is feeling that, he wants to abdicate his position as a prince. He is a prince. He has royal blood. If anything, he would probably become a king one day, but he doesn't want to do that. And so he's going to give up his power. He's going to relinquish it. He is going to cast it off of his body, his, identity, and he's going to put it away to the side. He's not going to claim it again, and he does this in a very formal manner. Okay, and so it's not like he's just running away, but he's also probably talking about it with his family, writing, signing some documents, saying he's no longer a part of the royal family, etc. And so that's kind of what the word abdicate here means, and let's go ahead and look at a few more sentences. He agreed to abdicate and retire in favor of the next in line for the throne. Again, for the throne, we can assume this is some kind of royal family, situation or context. Agreeing to abdicate, meaning that this person also has some kind of power that's inherent to their existence, and so they're willing to abdicate it. They want to get rid of it, relinquish it, but in a very formal manner. I want to abdicate the responsibility to deal with these acts in the correct manner. I want to very formally cast off or relinquish, get rid of these responsibilities that are, placed on my shoulders because I don't want to deal with it anymore, because I want to do it in the correct manner instead. And lastly, due to his declining health, the Prime Minister had no choice but to abdicate his office. So here we don't have a royalty member, we don't have a royal family member, but we do have a Prime Minister. And this is a government position, and of course, like all other positions of some kind of power, the word relinquish or abdicate would work the best here. It's a much more formal way of saying that he's going to get rid of his power or quit his job because of his health. We can say it in a much more formal manner because somebody else is going to have to take his place, and there's a lot of power involved in it as well. If it's something that's a really big event or there's some kind of power being exchanged, then we might say the word abdicate would be better than say give up, right? And so that is the word abdicate. I would highly recommend it, especially for formal government or some kind of royal positions that some people don't want to, have anymore. If they want to get rid of it, the word abdicate would be best for that. Or if you just want to be formal, it also works there too. The next word is accede. This is a verb meaning to express approval or give consent to, or to enter upon an office or position. I would say that between these two definitions, that first definition is much more important. It's much more common to see. It's the one that we will be running into the most. And so the next 4 sentences along with these synonyms, I would say the majority of it is based off that first definition. Okay, and I want us to remember that. That does not mean, though, that that second definition meaning is not going to be coming up. The point of me putting that there is because when you do run into it and it doesn't really feel like that first definition, that might be what it's talking about instead. The idea that it is to enter upon an office or a position. Again, it doesn't have to be royalty. It could also be some kind of high-standing position, whether that be in a business or in a government, etc. Synonyms are assent, consent, acquiesce, agree, subscribe, endorse, attain, and inherit, meaning I agree, I say yes to this, to give some kind of approval for. And then the last two, attain and inherit, those would be the 2 synonyms for that secondary definition. So I just wanted to give you guys that a little bit, but let's look at more into that first definition in our sentences. At your insistence and to avoid a prolonged argument, I will accede to your contract terms because you are, very invested in this, because you are pressing me on this, because it's quite urgent, and I don't want to have this argument with you. I don't want to keep going about this argument. I will agree to the terms you have listed here. I will accept them. I will assent to them. I will confirm them. I will consent. All really good ways to say it. I will agree to this. Accede is being used well in this sentence. The CEO made the wise decision to accede to customer or consumer pressure and lower the prices. And so here, apparently, they were selling something too expensive and the customer's like, lower the prices. We want them to be lower, much more affordable. And so the CEO made the wise decision of acceding to their requests. So saying, yes, I'll do that. I will agree upon whatever it is that you're asking for. Do not accede to his whims so readily, or else he will think that you are a wimp. If somebody asks you constantly, hey, can you do this for me? Can you do this for me? Do not simply accede to the whims so quickly, so easily. Don't just simply agree or consent or say you will do it, or else this person might think that you're a wimp. At least that's what the sentence is saying. Unless management is willing to accede to the employee's demands, the bakery will close. Unless management is willing to accept the demands that have been made, consent to, agree upon, etc., etc. To say yes to something, that is how we would say the word accede. Now, the reason why I'm kind of spending time on this one, especially that first definition, is again, that's how we tend to see it the most. It will be the most common definition of the word that you see here and how it's going to be used in the future. So I would say that doesn't mean, that secondary definition doesn't come up, but it might not come up as often as this one does. Then we have accord. This is a noun meaning a formal reaching of agreement or voluntary or spontaneous impulse to act. Doing something on somebody's accord or having some kind of accord, we can say it in either kind of way, but here I would also say that that first definition is the primary definition, the one that we will see most often. Synonyms are pact, treaty, compact, agreement, harmony, deal, concord, and unity. And the sentences reads as follows. They had to retire of their own accord, for they had no water for men or horses. They had to do this for their own harmony, their own concord, or their unity, some kind of agreement or some kind of pact or treaty that they have to make sure that they stay together, that they are in agreement with one another. I would say this is how we're using the word accord. Okay? And so for that reason, as you guys probably heard me say, I think harmony is a really good way of explaining what the word accord means to still be in good terms with another. I would say if not that one and you don't want to use that, you could also say maybe unity or concord. That's pretty good too. The entire table was in accord that mozzarella sticks would be the appetizer. They were all in harmony with one another. They were all under understanding or some kind of agreement with one another. All the singers were in accord with one another during the performance. And we're talking singers and performance. Maybe the word harmony would work best here, but the word accord also works really strongly too. Again, to get in line with one another and work together to create something really good, we might use the word accord. To be in accord, the team wore the same color shirts to the rally. So to be like one another, to stick with one another, they made sure that they all looked the same, so they really showed it to the audience members. And so next time when you're trying to say like, oh, they were doing this all together, right? We might say they were doing this together. They went out to dinner together. They made the decision to go to the mall afterwards together. It's kind of boring if we say that over and over again, right? And so instead we can offer the word accord in that kind of scenario and say, we were in accord to go to the mall. We were in accord to go to this restaurant, etc. And so that's a really good word to use. I would say very much so that first definition is the primary definition. Second one, like the other word, comes up every so often, but this is the most important way that we will see it, or the most common way as well. Then we have accumulate. So this is a verb meaning to gather or pile up, especially little by little, or to increase gradually in quality or number. So to accumulate something is to gather something, to pile it up. If you're gathering stuff, you're not neatly like putting it in a box or keeping it flat, but oftentimes if you're accumulating, you are gathering like this, okay? You're doing this so much that it's starting to pile up and get larger. Synonyms are balloon, burgeon, escalate, increase, expand, proliferate, multiply, swell, and then. So this is now C, part 1. Let's go ahead and take a look at the 10 words and say them out loud together so we know how to pronounce them. Chagrin, chide, chronic, clamor, clandestine, clarify, cleave, clutch, cogent, and coherent. So let's start with that first one, which is the word chagrin. This is a noun meaning disquietude or distress of mind, oftentimes caused by humiliation, disappointment, or some kind of failure. It is often some kind of, self-hatred, some kind of stress that you might feel, especially when you are feeling some type of embarrassment, some kind of humiliation, or perhaps some kind of failure as well during some kind of experience that you are having, okay? So this is how we're going to be understanding it. Synonyms are irritation, vexation, exasperation, discontent, annoyance, indignation, rankling, and umbrage. I think for our own purposes, when we're talking about the idea of chagrin or feeling some kind of chagrin, we might say that the word irritation, vexation, or oftentimes some kind of discontent or annoyance might be the best synonyms for us to keep in mind when we're looking at this word particularly. I would also say that with the word chagrin, I would say that most of us tend to think of the word annoyance or some kind of irritation. Oftentimes because of this humiliation, this kind of frustration that we feel, we tend to feel a little bit irritated or annoyed. And so I think those are the words that we want to be keeping in mind as maybe some immediate replacements when we're looking at the word chagrin, just for our benefit when we're using this word. So after finishing third in the race, I swallowed my chagrin and congratulated the winner. I got third place, somebody else got second, somebody else got first, and I'm annoyed, I'm irritated because I trained really hard and I really want to get first place and it didn't happen. And so what do? I swallow the fact that I am annoyed. I swallow my annoyance, I push it down, I push down my frustration, I push down my, the discontent that I feel, how upset I am, and then I go ahead and I congratulate the people who actually won because they worked really hard to get to that position anyway. And so my chagrin, I push it down, and then I go and congratulate others. I push down my annoyance. If Alan felt any chagrin about losing the contest, he hid it behind a huge smile. If he felt at all irritated, or for the fact, he was rankling, he was upset, he was discontent, if he was feeling any of those kinds of emotions, well, he did a really good job at hiding it because he was able to hide it behind a really big smile and say hello to everybody, congratulate everybody. It didn't seem too much of an issue. The poor mother learned to her chagrin that the nearest doctor lived 100 miles away. So to her frustration, to her anger, for her, inability to actually get there on time, especially if she needs a medical professional to help her with whatever she needs, she learned to her chagrin, her annoyance, her irritation, that the doctor is really, really far. It's over about 1 to 2 hours away. To his chagrin, the president realized his bill would not have the public's approval. To his irritation, to his annoyance, to his discontent, his frustration, he learned that it was not going to be popular and therefore he needed to do something about it to make sure it got passed. And so as we're looking at the word chagrin, we can think about it as, if we want to use the word irritation, that's fine. If we want to use the word discontent, that works too. But I would also argue that the word chagrin kind of encapsulates all of that as well. And so if you have the opportunity to use this word instead of, let's say, irritation, vexation, we might toss in this word too. Okay, and so with that being said, that is again the word chagrin. And let's move on to the word chide. This is a verb meaning to speak out in angry or displeased rebuke. Sometimes it is considered mild and constructive as well. And so we might have gotten into a word very similar to this in the video previously with the word censure. And you might be thinking, well, chide is pretty similar to that. It has the idea of rebuking someone. Even the synonyms are pretty similar. But the word chide is also not as extreme as censure. I would say that censure is a much more extreme, probably a harsher way of going about it. To chide someone wouldn't take that long, and also it's not over something that is oftentimes a really big problem. It's usually a very small problem. It's an annoyance. It's oftentimes to someone's chagrin. So, if you're chiding someone, you're oftentimes doing it to, say something constructive. It's oftentimes quite mild as well. And so, with that being said, the synonyms are admonish, reprimand, reprove, rebuke, reproach, berate, lambast, and lecture. And we've already talked about the word berate before, so I'm not going to go over that one. But I would say that if we're going to be using the word chide, the word lecture is quite good as well. Oftentimes you have to lecture somebody. It means that you're teaching them something too. You're trying to be constructive. Oftentimes you are trying to be mild. Especially if you're going to be lecturing someone as well, you don't tend to do this in a sense that is incredibly angry or displeased. You tend to take that second definition or that second part of that definition. And so chide is a bit softer and it is much more informative than, let's just say, censuring or criticizing. Or oftentimes doing it in a sense of, I want to help you out and make you figure out that this was not the right decision, but also give you some tips in the future so so when you're doing this again, you can do it in a much more proper manner. It never fails that I overindulge on treats on the weekend, then chide myself on Monday. I know I shouldn't be doing it, but I overeat on the weekends, I overindulge, and then when Monday comes around, I'm very harsh on myself. I'm angry with myself, but I tell myself, don't do that again. You really shouldn't do that again. It's not good for you. It's not healthy for you. The doctor said not to do it. And so you still try to be a little bit nice and try to learn something from it. I don't want the boss to chide me for being late again, so I'm getting there super early. And so I'm assuming that what happened last time was they got into trouble because they were late. And so the boss pulled them aside and said, a lot of people work in this company and, we want you to be on time because then everybody else, it's not fair to them. So you shouldn't do that. You're in trouble for being late, but also learn from your mistakes. I want you to, do really good next time. And so this person, they're like, I don't want to hear it next time. I don't want to have to deal with it again. I'm going to get there early. I realized that my accountant would chide me for not making my payments on time. They would say, you know how important it is to make your payments. It's important, right? But why aren't you doing them? So again, kind of rebuking them, saying, some negative things. I would say oftentimes complaining or stubbornly explaining that this is not what you should be doing, but also trying to teach them a lesson in the process. I knew that Mrs. Perkins would probably chide me for having terrible penmanship. Penmanship is your handwriting, the way that you write. And so she would probably chide him for the fact that he has poor penmanship, poor handwriting. So this is really bad, you shouldn't do it, but also let me teach you how to do it because this is not appropriate. Again, it is to punish someone or to express displeasure, but also at the same time, while expressing that displeasure, I would say that they are also trying to teach you also how to do it correctly. And so without that teaching aspect, I would say maybe the word chide wouldn't necessarily be as impactful as it is. I would also say that the word lecture is a really good way to replace the word chide if you want to use something different. Then we have the word chronic. This is an adjective meaning continuing or occurring again and again for a long time or habitually. I would say too, as we're looking at this word, the word chronic is not necessarily a positive word. I would also say that this is a very negative word instead. Oftentimes when we see the word chronic and we see that it's continuing on and on again and again, it's usually for a bad reason. We don't want something to be chronic. We don't want it to continue over and over again. We would much rather never experience it or experience it once and never experience it again. And so if we're calling something chronic instead of, let's say, perennial, then maybe the word chronic then is more negative, right? Perennial meaning happening forever and ever. So synonyms here are inveterate, confirmed, habitual, persistent, ceaseless, unabating, perennial, and eradicable. So out of these words, if we're talking about the negative ones, I would definitely say that the word persistent is one. I would say ceaseless is another. I would also say unabating. Those are probably the negative ones. If we're talking more probably positive, I would say confirmed or habitual or perennial. And I would say that maybe more in the middle, towards middle negative, I would say inveterate or ineradicable. Those are probably how I would maybe divide up the synonyms to really show that these are the ones to use for certain contexts. But if we're talking about chronic, again, very negative here. We might see this a lot with medical emergencies or medical symptoms. And so my aunt has cancer and has been dealing with chronic pain for several months. Continuing or occurring again and again for a long time, or habitual, chronic pain. Again, something that often has to do with something that is medically related to your body. I would say chronic pain is probably one of the ways that we will see this word used the most, specifically when we're talking about the adjective, some kind of pain, some kind of symptom. We're going to be seeing this a lot in the other sentences too. Since my father suffers from chronic arthritis, he has been walking with a cane for years. For years, meaning that it has been going on and on for a long period of time. Years is a long period of time. As well as that, we have chronic arthritis. It is ongoing. It continues and never gets better. It will continue on, probably even past this, for several more years. For 3 months, I have had chronic fatigue and headaches. So for 3 months, a long period of time, that is a very long stretch of time, in fact, to have chronic fatigue and headaches. And so you're constantly tired, you don't have energy, you're always having headaches, your head hurts. If you have those kinds of symptoms, they don't go away, it could be really debilitating, really lessening your energy, your motivation, I would say, your tendency to want to go out and do stuff. So moving on, let's go into D part 1 and look at the 10 words we're going to be looking at today, which are as follows, and let's go ahead and say these out loud together. Demure, deplore, derelict, derogatory, despicable, despondent, deter, detract, diagnosis, and diction. So let's start with that first word, which is the word demure. Demure here is an adjective meaning affectedly modest, reserved, or serious. And so the synonyms first, before I kind of get into it a little bit, is modest, quiet, diffident, timid, decorous, seemly, respectable, proper, and bashful. Now, I'm going to say here that the synonyms are very similar to the word demure, but I think that the word demure also has a very interesting connotation to it that you guys are going to be seeing very quickly on in these sentences that I have for us below. But one thing I want to note about the word demure is that oftentimes this is considered a word that has a specific gender or gender identity attached to it, specifically something that is incredibly feminine. Okay, so the word itself is oftentimes used to describe women or people who come off as women, people who are very feminine. This is a word that they will be using. Oftentimes that's because this is a word from long time ago, and this was a word that was used to keep women in a very specific box, acting in a certain way, acting in a very modest way, being quiet. It was oftentimes used to describe women particularly, very specifically. And so very rarely, I will say, that you see this word being used to describe anything that's quite masculine. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use it, but it will have that connotation and it will be effeminate for that reason. I would just say be aware of that if you're going to be using it, because I do think it matters quite a bit for this word specifically. And so again, I think the synonyms are pretty accurate in terms of the word demure. I would say if you want to use a word that doesn't really have too much of a feminine connotation, we might use the word modest, we might say the word timid, we might say the word, I would also say maybe proper or perhaps even respectable. Other words though do have a little bit of a feminine connotation or leaning towards it. So the sentences are: the little boxes were abundant on the runway, looking at times demure and other moments ostentatious. And so here we're talking about something that is inanimate, and so sometimes we're looking at these boxes and they look a little bit demure, they look small, they look timid, they look like they are not really out there saying much. They're very modest, probably not well decorated, and if they are, very simply decorated. There's probably 1 or 2 colors, and they're not bright colors. It's not neon, it's a very nice pastel or something that is very, I would also say maybe beigey, maybe something kind of white, nothing that stands out too much. We might call that demure. At the same time, we have the opposite. We have boxes that also look ostentatious, very flowery, something that is very pretentious, maybe something that is also quite gaudy. And so we can say that the word ostentatious is the opposite of the word demure. They are antonyms of each other, and the word demure, again, something that is quite reserved, serious, or affectedly modest. My sister is too outgoing for anyone to ever accuse her of being demure. She goes out too much, she is loud, she's abrasive, she talks, and she is not reserved. She is not modest. She is not going to be quiet, sitting there in the corner, unlike the next person that we're going to talk about in this following sentence here. But, she cannot be accused of being demure simply because she goes out too much. She is too much of a firecracker. She is always doing something instead. At the party last night, Iris was demure and stayed in a corner by herself. She was modest. She was reserved. She was quite serious. She chose not to be out and about and outgoing. She kind of kept to herself. She made sure that she was in her own space. That means that she is demure. She's not trying to go into anybody's space, and she's trying to keep to herself. And by nature, the princess was a demure woman who hated being in the spotlight. So again, very reserved, doesn't want to be out in the spotlight, doesn't want to be out and about, being told different things and being seen in a certain way. And so she keeps to herself. She makes sure that she has her own space to call private. So that's the word demure. As we can see with all three of these sentences, they are talking about someone who is a woman. I would say that it's important to just remember that is the common way that we will see this word being used. Again, it can be used with inanimate objects like boxes, but if we're going to talk about a person, we want to say that they're modest or they're very reserved, the word demure might come in play there, and it might be very handy too. Then we have the word deplore. This is a verb meaning to feel or express grief for, or to consider unfortunate or deserving of depreciation. Or here, deprecation, sorry. And so synonyms are lament, bewail, bemoan, detest, despise, abhor, execrate, deprecate, and decry. And so here, when we're talking about deploring something, we are oftentimes disliking it, but also showing kind of grief, showing kind of disappointment in the thing as well. We're also talking about it being to consider it as unfortunate or deserving of some kind of deprecation, that it deserves or should be understood to be less than almost as well. It should be considered less than some other thing. It is deserving of being thought of as less than. And so for that reason, I would say that from the synonyms, I think that the words bemoan is good. I would say the word deprecate is good. I'd also say maybe the word abhor is good too. Those three are the words that I would suggest. We deplore the development and distribution of nuclear weapons. We don't like it. We think we should consider it being less than. We should do other things with that. We want to express that we are not happy with it. We are sad about it. We're upset about this. Also, we're talking about the development, the creation, and the distribution, the fact that we're sending out to other countries. We don't like the fact that nuclear weapons are still being made. So, you know, oh no, Oppenheimer, you did this to us, right? And so we deplore the development and the distribution. We hate the fact that this is happening. We think that we should be thinking about this as not a good thing. We should make this less than. Teachers deplore student behaviors that distract from lectures. They don't like it. They think that it should be considered less than. They don't want to have to think about it. They think that needs to be deprecated, that it is not something of value. It is not worth something good. The animal activists deplore the cruel practices used to obtain fur coats. They hate it. They think that it is something we should be upset about. They grieve over it. They show some kind of grief. They show that it should be considered less than, that it is something we should deprecate, no longer have value. The fact that there is a lot of cruelty when it comes to obtaining fur coats and the fur that is needed to make these coats from animals, the torture and the pain that they go through, we deplore those practices. We think it's not good and we want to express it in certain ways. And lastly, how can you deplore my behavior while acting in the same manner? And so how can you stand there and say that you don't like the way that I act when in fact you yourself act the exact same way? How can you say that my acting is worth less than yours when you again are acting in the same way that I am? And so that's how we can see the word deplore being used here. It does have two kind of different meanings, but I would go so far as to say that they're pretty similar. And so when we're using the word deplore, just don't forget, it means both to show some kind of anger and frustration, but also the desire to make less than or not as worthy. Then the word derelict. Derelict is an adjective, abandoned especially by the owner or occupant. We talked about the word defunct earlier, right, in a different video. And so we have the word derelict too. And so we can say that they're somewhat similar, but specifically when we're talking about derelict, it was something that was once occupied and the owner has left it. And so the occupant or the owner has abandoned this area, this thing, then we call it derelict, okay? So if it's defunct, it's, it's no longer working, it's no longer functioning, but derelict, it has been abandoned by somebody else who owned it. Synonyms are dilapidated, ramshackle, rickety, forsaken, bereft, desolate, forlorn, and neglected. I would say if we're using the word derelict, we might use the word forsaken. That's probably a really good one because it means that somebody has thrown it aside or abandoned it. We can say the word neglected is working too here. We could also probably say that from me personally, would say maybe the word dilapidated if we want to focus on the idea of abandonment and the way that it has, let's say, gone down in quality over the years. The tower currently stands derelict, covered in a layer of ivy in the garden of a private house. And so the tower was once owned by somebody, it was once taken care of by somebody, but now it is standing derelict. It is abandoned. The owner no longer owns it. They have left the property. No one's taking care of it. And so it is now abandoned. It looks dilapidated. It looks worn. It looks like it's going to crumble one day. And that's how we can see the word derelict being used here. Again, abandoned, often by somebody who used to occupy it. Out of fear for my safety, I chose not to walk inside of the derelict barn. So again, once more, abandoned by somebody, not taken care of anymore. It is dilapidated. It's going to fall down. It is probably going to be very dangerous to walk in here, especially if it is an old barn that has been abandoned. And so it makes sense why this person would not want to go in. While the derelict car is not working now, it will start after I replace the spark plugs. And so while this abandoned cars are usually owned by people, it's not working, it's been abandoned, it's older, it doesn't have spark plugs, it needs to have them replaced. So we can assume for all those reasons, the word derelict would work really well here. And my friend is a photographer who loves to search abandoned areas for derelict buildings. So abandoned areas, we can say that this area is also probably, used to be occupied by lots of different people. This could be entire ghost towns. This could be entire blocks of apartment buildings that have been cleared out. And so in these abandoned areas, this friend likes to go ahead and look for and search for derelict buildings, buildings that were once owned by people, once occupied by people. Let's keep the ball rolling with P part 1, and these are the 10 words we're going to be looking at in this specific video, okay? So with that being said, let's go ahead and read them out loud so we know what the pronunciation is. Patent, patron, patronizing, pedantic, pensive, perceptible, perjury, permeate, pernicious, and perspicacious. So let's go ahead and start with that first one, which is probably the word patent, also the easiest one out of all of these, I would say. Patent is a noun meaning to obtain or grant an official document conferring a right or a privilege. Oftentimes this is like the way that you would imagine some kind of permission slip, but think about it in a more formal or more professional way, probably more governmental too. Synonyms here would be copyright, license, right, permit, privilege, charter, franchise, and trademark. And so as we're seeing this word patent and the idea of it conferring a right or a privilege, the way that we can think about the word patent is oftentimes with technology, some kind of new invention. If somebody has the rights to it, they mean that they have a patent to it. Oftentimes this also means that they own it. They own the intellectual property of it as well, and so people can't just simply copy and paste and make it their own. There's a reason why certain kinds of brands, like let's say Coca-Cola, has a patent on their ingredients specifically for their drink. That way no one can simply steal it and recreate it and call it their own. So for that reason, when we say patent, it's again very much a formal, governmental, maybe also in a business sense, a right to own a specific kind of property. And that's why we have such synonyms here. I would just say that if we're talking about a patent, you just want to remember it as something that has been created that is oftentimes an original idea, trying to claim it as one's own. I would say the other synonyms here depends on the context and depends on what it is that you're specifically talking about. You would be using these words. And so, not necessarily saying that they won't apply, they do apply for sure, but I feel like it really does depend on the sentence for you to be looking into this. And so if you guys are curious, go ahead and look these up later at a separate point. Edison's telephone patent was granted for the United Kingdom. And so when we're talking about the telephone, right? Hello, who is this? How are you? When we're talking about a telephone, when it was first invented, Edison, his patent or his telephone, his idea was patented. It was licensed. It was given a right to him. He owned it. He owned it as an idea. He's applying for a patent on the new piece of equipment that will make farming easier. So it's a new piece of equipment, hasn't existed before, and he's applying for a patent, a right, a license that says that he is allowed to use it, also that he's allowed to own it, the fact that he has created it himself, that he gets the right to it. So if there's another company that wants to make it and then sell it without giving him the permission or the credit, then he can go ahead and start suing people for that kind of act. Graham Bell's telephone patent was granted for the United Kingdom. And so we have it again here, not talking about Edison, but we have Graham Bell, two different kinds of telephones. Another patent was granted. Again, the same idea applies here, that it is some kind of technology, some kind of independent thought, new idea, original idea that we can oftentimes put a right to. Saying here, we're putting a right to something, saying that you have the right to own it. And lastly, the lawyer explained that the patent would take years to acquire for my product. And so here, once more, my product being something that doesn't exist on the market yet, it hasn't been created, it's very original. And so if I want to make it a rightfully my kind of, product, that way nobody else can just simply steal it from me, that way it's licensed. So if I want to sell it, I can go ahead and start manufacturing it in larger quantities, then I would need some kind of patent, some kind of legal document saying that I'm allowed to own it, as well as allowed to sell it. And so that's the way that we can think about the word patent. Again, it's usually just a piece of paper that says, hey, this belongs to somebody. Hey, you have the right to go ahead and sell this. Again, something of a permission slip on the most formal and most professional level. And then we move on to patron. Patron here is one that uses wealth or influence to help an individual, an institution, or a cause. When we're thinking about a patron here, I want us to think about a very specific person, not usually somebody or something that is just walking around and walking about. It's not an average person. Oftentimes, a patron will be somebody who has a lot of either wealth or influence. Oftentimes, I would say if we're talking more classically, we would say wealth. Maybe right now in our contemporary era, we might say the word influence too. And so this is the way that we can see, support for an individual. Let's say, a singer being supported by a really rich person. An institution like a university being, sponsored or being, donated a lot of money to by another rich person, or a cause. And this one could be, if there has been a natural disaster that occurred, if there is a patron who wants to donate a lot of money or bring a lot of awareness to it, they are using that wealth or influence to create some kind of impact on the idea. And so synonyms here would be sponsor, backer, financier, guarantor, donor, contributor, promoter, and supporter. Now, I would say, except for maybe promoter and supporter, out of all of them, actually as well, probably the word contributor too. Contributor, promoter, and supporter, these three don't necessarily talk about wealth. There's no implicit and necessary idea that there is, money involved in supporting somebody, and so this could be all taken in the sense of influence. But if we're talking about money in particular or getting something, we would use any of the other five: sponsor, backer, financier, guarantor, and donor. I would also say for the word donor, that one can be used for a lot of different things. It doesn't just have to be influence or wealth. It can also be, in the same way that we have donations and donations areas to donate something. A donor is somebody who donates, okay? And so with that context in mind, make sure you use that synonym very effectively. But he was a patron of learning and, like most peers of his age, a great architect. He was a patron of learning. He was a very big supporter, especially here if we're talking about him going to school. That means they probably had enough wealth in his, life for him to pay for it. If we're assuming also by the way that the sentence is written, talking about peers his age, wanting to become an architect, we can assume that this is probably a much longer time ago. And so for that reason, we can say a patron of learning. He is a supporter. He is a backer. He is a contributor. He is a promoter. He wants other people to learn as well. As patron of the Arts and Crafts Museum, he won a high reputation. As patron, as somebody who supports it, here we're talking maybe wealth. Are we talking maybe, some kind of influence? I would say here maybe we're talking more as influence, and we're also talking about some kind of institution, this being an arts and crafts museum. Again, it could be an institution, it can be an individual, or it can be a cause. Because Laura is an avid reader, she is a frequent patron at my bookstore. And here we're talking about a bookstore, so which one is it? This would not be a cause, it's not an individual. Here, another institution. It is a business place, it is a place of commerce, and so here a frequent patron, somebody who supports it by giving them money. Lots of wealth, lots of influence. If they constantly buy books, we can say the word wealth here. And lastly, I have a regular patron who eats meatloaf at the same time every day. And so here, patron, regular patron being somebody who supports the company or supports the institution with some kind of wealth. Every day, coming in, eating the same thing over and over again, they're constantly going to be paying the money. And so it doesn't have to be a large sum of money. You can also think about it in the sense of a customer, but anybody who is supporting another thing through the means of wealth or influence would be a patron. More money, if we're thinking lots more money, we might say that would be a patron long ago. Right now, we also use the word patron also to mean customer if that fits. Then we go on to patronizing, and this is an adjective. No, it's nothing like the word patron. Here characterized by a superior attitude towards others or marked by condescension. As you can tell with the definition, it is not similar whatsoever. Synonyms are condescending, lofty, supercilious, snobbish, snooty, uppity, disdainful, and high and mighty. Thinking that one is better than others, okay? Putting yourself on a pedestal, thinking that you are higher in power, in influence, and wealth than other people below you. She eyed him, not sure patronizing tone wasn't meant to rile her. So not sure his patronizing tone wasn't meant to rile her. If you have a patronizing tone, what might that sound like, right? So if patronizing means to be condescending, to have condescension, to have a superior attitude towards others, this means that a patronizing tone would be, I am speaking to you as if you are less than me, as if you are worth less than me, if you have less power than me, then I would be using the word patronizing to describe my tone. My patronizing coworker thinks he is superior to everyone at the office. Makes a lot of sense. He thinks he's better than everybody else. He thinks he's superior. There's no evidence to show that he is superior. It's not as if he is the CEO. He's just another coworker. And so being at the same level as everybody else, he still thinks that he's better than everyone. And therefore, the word patronizing works really good. Again, superiority. He is always patronizing his children and criticizing their choices. He probably here, let's talk about this he relationship as maybe a father talking to their children. And so he is always patronizing his children and criticizing their choices. Two kids, they want to do stuff, and so the dad, instead of saying, I'm really supportive, good, or maybe I don't think that's necessarily the best idea, let's go ahead and try to find something else to do. Instead of saying stuff like that, he instead starts to patronize them instead, saying, I know better than you. You don't know anything. If you don't know anything, don't even try. Why don't you just listen to what I have to say and leave it at that? So again, looking down on them just because they're children and he feels that he is better than them and more superior than them. Speaking slowly in a patronizing manner, the ignorant waitress insulted my friend. And so she's ignorant and she's a waitress, and so, she's being the person who's serving others and she's not listening. She's also being very patronizing. She's trying to make sure that the condescension is coming through, and she also... Let's go ahead and get straight on into it with our part 1, and these are the 10 words we're going to be looking at in this video. Like always, let's go ahead and read them out loud together, that way we know what the pronunciation is. Rancorous, ratify, ravage, ravenous, raise, rebuke, recalcitrant, rectify, recurrent, and refuge. Let's talk about that first one, which is the word rancorous. Rancorous here is an adjective meaning marked by bitter, deep-seated ill will or deep malevolence. Some kind of, oftentimes, internal, very, I would say, hidden as well, type of anger and evil thought that you might have for another person. If we're often talking about this idea of a bitter, deep-seated ill will, it means that you don't want something good to happen to somebody else, and it's really pressed down and maybe even suppressed at some points inside your own self. And so that's the way that we can kind of understand the word rancorous, as we're seeing it very negative, the way that it means, to have ill will towards somebody and it be deep-seated and very bitter, again, very negative. Synonyms for this would be spiteful, hateful, malicious, acrimonious, malign, hostile, venomous, and vindictive. We've already talked about the word acrid before. We've also looked at the word acrimonious in our synonym sections before. Again, being very sour, being very pungent even. And so with those synonyms, I would definitely say, if we're trying to say, being very malevolent, being very ill-will towards somebody else, we would say spiteful or hateful or malicious. I would say definitely these are really good in terms of this word. Additionally, I would also say the word vindictive if you want to get back at them in the sense of, trying to get some kind of revenge. And if you want to talk more about, I would say, a more active type of anger, more active and less deep-seated, then we would say maybe hostile or venomous. He was defeated for re-election the following year following a rancorous campaign. And so this campaign itself was not a very positive one. It wasn't talking about all the good things he could do. Rather, it was talking more about all the negative things that somebody else has done, which should, make perhaps them look better than the other candidate. And so here, a rancorous campaign, a very negative one, a one that would have a lot of bitter, deep-seated ill will, some kind of deep malevolence and hatred and anger and vitriol, some kind of spitefulness, some kind of hatefulness included in this campaign. And so it makes a lot of sense, I would say. Oftentimes negativity doesn't make for a good, I would say, campaigning structure. I would say positivity usually works best. The deal ended after a series of rancorous disputes that went nowhere. And so here the deal ended. Oftentimes if the deal is ending, not necessarily a good thing. You want to have a deal in order to get some kind of benefit. Here though, it's ending because of a series of rancorous disputes. Disputes would be some kinds of conflicts. I would also say maybe disagreements. We could say maybe like bursts of shouting matches, arguments and stuff like that. Rancorous too, once more, being very hateful, being very spiteful, having a lot of vitriol, having a lot of vengeance, and wanting to really, I would say, highlight this idea of negativity. His speech was a rancorous attack on young people and how he disagreed with them. And so here we're talking about disagreeing with him, maybe young people specifically here is what he's talking about. But again, disagreement, hatefulness, having a dislike, or maybe even here, not necessarily seeing eye to eye with somebody. But we're going to go so far as to say that this is a rancorous attack. So it's not just any old attack, but rather it's very spiteful. Once more, there's a lot of hatred that's going to be deep-seated in this attack itself. And so it's characterized as being more than just negative. It is incredibly negative and very hateful. And lastly, this is a rancorous autobiography in which the author heaps blame on just about everyone. And so when we're talking about an autobiography, talking about the self, talking about the person who is here writing their life, instead of just simply saying that there were other aspects that really came into play in the way that he lived, we're talking about a rancorous autobiography where he's filling it a lot with hatred. And again, here a lot of vitriol, vengeance, and I would also say maybe vindictiveness too. Again, some kind of bitter, deep-seated ill will. And so that's the word rancorous, and the way that we're going to use it, again, it's a very negative word, and so pretty much as long as you remember that, it's not going to be too difficult to use. Then we move on to ratify, and this is a verb meaning to approve or sanction formally. Synonyms here would be confirm, approve, sanction. We have endorse, accept, affirm, validate, authorize, formalize, and certify. So as we can see with the synonyms, we have two different things going on. We can tell that first off, it is talking about approving something, okay, allowing something to occur. But secondly, when we're also looking at the word ratify, we can tell that this is probably a much more formal and much more professional word. Again, probably one of those words that come up a lot in especially government-related topics, maybe politics-related topics, or if we're talking about anything that has to do with legal code, we're going to be seeing the word ratify quite often. And so out of all of these, I would just say, just to keep in mind that if you're talking about it in a less formal way, then you might want to use words like the word confirm, endorse, accept, affirm, or maybe even, I would say, validate or authorize. The higher you go up and the higher the problem is then maybe where you use the other synonyms too. Because one state has chosen not to ratify the amendment will not be added to the U.S. Constitution. Here we're saying that one state has chosen not to approve of, okay? Approve of formally here, again, we're talking about a government, we're talking about the U.S. amendment, and so they all have to be willing to ratify it. If that's not the case, if they're not all going to approve it, it's not going to be passed. Today, the governor will ratify the bill by signing it during a press conference. He will approve of it in public. Again, here we're talking about a governor. It's going to be something that is a legislative bill, and therefore, once more, it is, I would say here, very governmental, political, and again, very formal. Until all of the countries ratify the treaty, the war will continue. Again, countries ratifying a treaty here being some kind of formal document, approving of a formal document, especially during wartime. Of course, here we wouldn't want to say just simply the word confirm or approve. We want to use the word ratify because we're talking about a very specific document here. In the same way we're talking about a treaty, we're talking about a bill up there too. And if the president chooses to ratify the budget proposal, it will go into effect in January. And so here we're talking about the budget being something that we are approving of, and the word ratify is also working well in this kind of context because we have somebody like a president who is going to be doing the budgeting, okay? And so when we're talking about the budget that we're talking, here that will go into effect in January and ratifying it, this president could be anybody from the person who's in the White House to maybe the president of a company. In either case, we're talking about it in a very formal manner to say yes to something, and so we're going to say the word ratify works here too. Again, the word ratify oftentimes is only used in connotations or contexts that deal with anything governmental, something that is more political, or something that might include the workings of the law. If it doesn't really include that, you might not see the word ratify. Then we move on to the word ravage. This is a verb meaning to commit destructive action or to wreak havoc on and affect destructively. And so as we can tell with the word ravage, it's not very positive either, like that first word we were looking at, rancorous. And so when we're talking about the word ravage, I would say one of the things that we want to keep a really big eye on is this idea of destructive action, to constantly want to destroy something. I would say that's one big aspect of it, and also to do it in a very chaotic manner. We've already looked at the word havoc before, and so this should give us an idea of how this damage is being done. It's not a simple, slow, very specific kind of damage. It is creating chaos and also creating damage too. Synonyms here would be devastate, ruin, destroy, wreck, raze, despoil, level, harry, havoc, and pillage and plunder. We've also talked about the words pillage and plunder in a previous video, and so these ones should come very naturally to us. It took the teething puppy only a few minutes to ravage the stuffed animal. And so if you guys have ever raised a puppy before, you would know that just like any kid as well, oftentimes when you are young, you lose all your teeth and it itches and it hurts. And so you want to start biting on things that would be really cold because your teeth are growing in. Same thing happens for teething puppies. They want to bite on stuff because their teeth hurts. And so what do? They will oftentimes have really sharp teeth that can rip into anything. So it makes sense here that they're going to chaotically destroy a stuffed animal because they are teething. It's only going to take them a few minutes to do this too. Despite the efforts of the firemen, the fire continued to ravage the forest. And so once more, creating destruction, fire causes a lot of destruction already, but since we're using the word ravage, we can also assume that maybe this fire is also very out of control. It's going to be a very large fire. It's not going to be something small or simple. It's going to be one that's so big that it's hard to manage and control even for the firemen. If diabetes is not controlled, it can ravage many organs in the human body. This is absolutely true. It's not just going to destroy your body, again, being an illness and a disease that you don't want to be, constantly dealing with. This is diabetes itself is not necessarily something that is considered good or healthy in any capacity. And therefore, it can ravage many organs. It can make you sick. It can make you ill. It can shut down your body if you do not take care of it. And it can also be quite chaotic as well. So keeping that in mind, the Category 5 hurricane will ravage the city and leave only devastation in its wake. We also have to think about this in the sense of natural disasters. And so if we have something like a hurricane, specifically Category 5, very dangerous, it will cause a lot of destruction. And if we have things such as hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, we all know that there is a lot of chaos that is around this kind of disaster, oftentimes because people lose their homes and people also lose their livelihoods. And so for that reason, the word ravage. Let's go ahead and get started with S part 1 and look at the 10 words we're going to be looking at today. And they read as follows, so like always, let's go ahead and take a look at them, say them correctly, and that way we know what the pronunciation is. Simultaneous, skeptical, smuggle, sojourn, solace, spat, spontaneous, sporadic, stagnant, and stalwart. Let's start with that first one, which is the word simultaneous. And this word is an adjective meaning existing or occurring at the same time or exactly coincident. Synonyms here are contemporaneous, concurrent, coinciding, parallel, agreeing, and accompanying. Now, the way that I want us to remember the word simultaneous here is to think about one thing happening and another thing happening at the same period, at the same time, going on in the exact same manner. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that one person has to be eating and then another person has to be eating at the exact same time, but rather meaning that in the general space and the area and the consideration of time that we're thinking, two things are going on in the very exact moment. That's how we want to be thinking about the word simultaneous here, and that's why we're saying, existing or occurring. It could exist at the same time or it can be happening at the same time. For that reason, we have these synonyms though. I would say that out of all of them, the word contemporaneous is really good, along with the word concurrent, as well as the word coinciding. I think when we get to the words parallel or agreeing or even the word accompanying, I think it's more talking about the relationship itself, not necessarily the fact that we're talking about something existing or occurring at the same time. So with that being said, let's take a look at the sentences. The patient has simultaneous infections going on that will require 2 different treatments. And so here, we're talking about 2 different infections or more, but oftentimes also we often use the word simultaneous to talk about 2 things happening at the same time. And so when we're talking about infections going on simultaneously, we might say that there's an ear infection and maybe there is about, like some kind of throat infection or, and another infection that's going on somewhere down here instead. And so there's 2 different areas, 2 different kinds of treatments that are necessary, and therefore we're going to be saying 2 different treatments once more at the bottom of this sentence. And so again, simultaneous, occurring or existing at the same time. Usually this is 2 things, not usually more than 2. I would say the rule of thumb is if it's not specified, it usually means 2. Simultaneous protests were being held at the same time to support animal rights. And so if we're talking about simultaneous protests, we could probably be talking about in one city there's a protest going on, and in another city it's also going on at the same time. Oftentimes here we might also say it's run by the same people, it's the same company, or maybe it's the same organization, and they're trying to raise awareness in different areas of the country. And so we might have protests that happen on the exact same day, at the exact same time. That way it looks like it's a much bigger deal. And that's why, again, we're using the word simultaneous here, because we're saying that it's occurring at the exact same moment. A simultaneous release of the movie and its soundtrack on CD is scheduled for today. Now here we're being a bit more specific. We're talking about the movie and its soundtrack at the same time, on the same day. Again, simultaneous release. The moment it hits noon, both of them are going to be open and accepted for, some kind of public consumption. And the troops will carry out simultaneous attacks on their enemies to corner them. And so one attack coming from the left and one attack coming from the right, simultaneous, existing or something occurring at the exact same time. We have that idea here as well with the word simultaneous, really describing and putting into perspective what we're talking about when we say the word attacks. So again, that's the word simultaneous, existing or occurring at the same moment, at the same time. It doesn't always have to be the exact same, I would say process or perhaps even action, but again, starting and exacting in the moment that we are talking about being a very specific, fixed time. Then we move on to the word skeptical. Skeptical is an adjective meaning relating to, characteristic of, or marked by doubt or incredulity. Not being able to believe something, that would be the word skeptical here. And so that's the reason why we also have these synonyms down here. Dubious, doubtful, questioning, cynical, distrustful, mistrustful, and disbelieving. If you don't believe something, you are skeptical. This is the reason why people will say skepticism or a skeptic. A skeptic is somebody who doesn't believe. And so, as we're looking at these synonyms, I would say that all of them are quite good. The only one that I would say maybe we don't want to consider this word exactly as, the word skeptical here would be the word cynical. Skeptical means that you don't believe it or you don't trust it. Cynical means that you already have a negative impression of it. And so for that reason, I would say while the word cynical, if you're trying to express that you don't believe something and you don't want to because you have a negative outlook on it, then you could probably use it. Other than that, though, I would say you might want to use a different kind of synonym if you're trying to talk about the word here, skeptical, with any of the other synonyms here too. And so with that in mind, talking about some kind of marking of doubt or incredulity, let's go ahead and look at the sentences. Molly appeared skeptical while the others exchanged knowing looks with each other. And so maybe these two people are thinking, we know you're lying. But maybe Molly doesn't really necessarily know all the information and all the details about what's been going on. And so instead, she cannot share that knowing look, but rather she's sitting there, she's hearing this for the first time, and she's like, I don't believe what you're saying. I'm very doubtful that what you're saying is in fact very true. And for that reason, the face that I'm giving shows that I am mistrustful. I am distrustful. I am dubious. I am doubtful. I actually don't think what you're saying is quite true. Skeptical of strangers, the toddler refused to talk to anyone who he had never met before. Probably a really good survival skill, especially for children. This is really important. Don't talk to strangers, especially when you're young. And so skeptical of strangers, doubtful, doesn't trust them, doesn't believe that they're good people unless they've already met them before. And so the toddler using that for their advantage is a good thing here. When I said I finished my homework early, Mom looked skeptical. And so I feel like maybe this is something that I've definitely been through. Maybe you have been through this as well. But when you say, oh, I've already finished my homework, and then your parents just kind of stop and stare at you and say, but did you really, when did you finish? And they have this look on their face as though they're, it's making them really think about whether or not they believe you when you say that you finished your work and you actually did it on time. Again, being very doubtful or having some kind of distrust. He says he can win, but I remain skeptical that his skills will be enough. And so one last time here, when we're talking about he can win, but I remain skeptical. He says he can do it. I'm not quite sure. I'm doubtful. I don't have the trust in him. I think he's going to mess up. I don't think he's skilled enough to do this. And so when we talk about the word skeptical here, that's what we mean in terms of his skills and whether or not we can trust the skills and we can actually put a lot of faith in that as well. So that's the word skeptical. Let's move on to the word smuggle. This is a verb meaning to import or export something in violation of the custom laws. And I would say just laws in general too. It doesn't always have to be about customs. If you are smuggling something, you're oftentimes trying to very secretively move one thing to another place without the permission or any know-abouts of what's going on. And oftentimes this is against the law as well. Synonyms would be export, hide, bootleg, deal, moonshine, pirate, sneak, spirit, rustle, and traffic. I would say if we're trying to go for the same energy as the word smuggle here, we would want to go with the word bootleg or moonshine. Pirate is good. I would also say spirit is good, along with the word traffic. These are the words that I would say in these synonyms are very similar to, if not exactly the same as, the word smuggle. Now I want us to remember that because even though it might look like the word traffic isn't that, impressive, or the word spirit, I would say again, you are going to be seeing these words quite often, especially in, I would say, history classes or political science courses, something related to the government. Oftentimes, these kinds of ideas do come up because, again, it is something that has to deal with the law. Tunnels were dug so movers could smuggle immigrants into the city without being caught. And so here we're not necessarily talking about whether or not the immigrants should be here or not. That's a completely different story. Rather, we're talking about the idea of smuggling them, meaning that without anybody knowing, without any kind of whereabout known by anybody else, they are moving surreptitiously a group of people from one place to another place, very stealthily. Again, trying to hide it because also it might be going against laws. Then we also have these sentences too. Coming in from China, businessmen are trying to smuggle in cheap clothing to resell. And so when we're trying to smuggle it in, it's illegal to resell cheap clothing, specifically in certain countries. It's against the law. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to sneak it in. That way they can still continue to do it anyway. Sneaking something in against custom laws. Again, if you're going from another country to another country, that's customs. That would work really well there. My mother tried to smuggle candy and drinks into the movie theater, but we were caught. Now, for the first two sentences, we were talking more about the legal sense, right? If something says, there's a law stating that you cannot, secretly move people from one place to another, maybe you're doing something that is illegal here in terms of smuggling clothing to resell. We also have it in this sense where oftentimes American movie theaters will not allow you to bring some kinds of food, especially food from your own home, into the theater. And so people will try to smuggle in candy, popcorn, and drinks from their home because it's much cheaper. And so that happens a lot, but it's against the rules of the movie theater and therefore, again, breaking some kind of law. Breaking here, though, some kind of rule instead, the word smuggle will work just fine. And lastly, the paintings had been smuggled out of the country before the war. And so once more, surreptitiously, sneakily moved from one place to the other against the way that people wanted to stay. Okay, so maybe it was supposed to stay in the country. They decided that's not the case. We're going to move it back to a different country. And so the best way to do that is to secretly move it.